Good evening. My name is Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. I'm the Director of Research here at the Agnon House, and I occupy a variety of other positions in Jewish life and learning and teaching around town. We have gathered here tonight to speak a little bit about the impact, the influence of Agnon on the late Amos Oz, who passed away this past December. And throughout the summer here at Beit Agnon, we've had a series of talks examining this interaction between these two great authors, perhaps the two greatest modern Hebrew authors here in the state of Israel, men of different generations, men of different outlooks, but significant figures in Hebrew letters. Agnon, of course, was and is to this day the only Israeli author, the only Hebrew author to win a Nobel Prize. And Oz, of course, was the perennial, also ran every year. The betting markets, the Scottish betting markets, would try to predict who was going to be the Nobel laureate, and Oz's name was always on the short list. You know, not just Oz. There are plenty of authors whose names are always on the short list. I think of Philip Roth amongst them. You've heard me mention Roth in the past. Where the morning that, the day that they announced the Nobel Prize and the author isn't selected, some reporter puts a microphone in his face and says, "No, what's your reaction to not getting the Nobel Prize?" And the author invariably says, "Oh, was that today? I wasn't even paying attention." From which I understand they were paying a lot of attention. Right? I presume that they made sure that the phone was on the hook before they went to sleep, so that if they get the call from Sweden, the line shouldn't be engaged. But an author's greatness, although of course here we're very proud of the Nobel Prize, an author's greatness is not measured in prizes, but in their enduring worth, in what they communicate to us, both when they were writing, as well as for generations to come. And there's no doubt that, like Agnon, we're coming up next winter is the 50th anniversary of Agnon's 50th Yortzeit. Will be marked next February. And I have no doubt that in a half a century from now, Oz will continue to be read and interpreted and will continue to inspire us and to cause us to think and to wrestle with a whole variety of issues in Jewish life and Jewish existence here, particularly here in the state of Israel, in ways that he did during his life. Of course, those of you, just by a show of hands, who has read Sipur al Ahava v'Choshech, A Tale of Love and Darkness? Right? So it's almost everyone. Who saw the movie? There was a movie, fewer people. There was a movie that was received ambivalent reviews, but I thought it was actually quite good in some ways. It was made by Natalie Portman. It came out a couple 3-4 years ago in Hebrew. With you can get it in English subtitles, and of course it's a very long book. It's a very long memoir. It's not, interestingly, perhaps his most well-known, most widely read work, A Tale of Love and Darkness, is not a work of fiction. He was principally a novelist, a fiction writer, and his most significant work is an autobiography. Although there's questions about how much. Well, it's true for all autobiographers, how close it bears to the exact letter of history with a capital H. But in all cases, it's a memoir. You don't buy it in the fiction side of the store. You buy it in the non-fiction side of the store. And there are, of course, many scenes in it that reference Agnon that take place right here in the house. We'll see them momentarily. And when there was this rumor that they were making this film, that Natalie Portman was coming to Yerushalayim to make the film, and they were even casting Charedim, or people that could dress up like Charedim to play extras in the scenes that take place in Geula. Everybody wanted to, I guess, see Natalie Portman or be in the movie, and I was hoping that they would film scenes here, that they would want to include the scenes that take place at Beit Agnon, but that, I guess, was left on the cutting room floor. They didn't have place for it. But what does enter the movie is this idea that young Klausner, Amos Oz is born in here in Eretz Yisrael, and he is born Klausner. he later, when he goes off to Kibbutz Huldah as a young man, as a teenager, he Hebraizes his name, as was the fashion, from Klausner. And as you can hear, the resonance of the word Oz in Klausner. Right, that's where he gets Oz. But Oz, Klausner is, of course, this European name. Oz means strength. It's a good Israeli name that someone should choose for themselves in the early 1950s, as was the fashion. But Oz's parents, who had, well, you've read the book, so you know, Oz's father was something of an unsuccessful academic. Oz's mother suffers from depression. She's a very literate, very learned, very educated, sophisticated woman. And here in the land of Israel, she doesn't find herself, and presumably she brings with her in her DNA this depression that she suffers from until her tragic suicide when Amos, the only child, is 12 years old in 1952. Aryeh Klausner, Amos's father, has an uncle named Yosef Klausner. Yosef Klausner was one of the first generation of professors at the Hebrew University. He was this learned academic, Litvak. In the days when a person could have an academic position in virtually every department in the university. He taught philosophy, and he taught literature, and he taught history, and what else didn't he do? Almost everything. Talmud, wrote many books, and lived down the road. The street is called Rehov Klausner, because when he passed away, they renamed it in his honor. He lived down the road on the northeast corner of Klausner and Beitar. Today, there's a rather nondescript apartment building. The site of his house having been torn down and replaced, like so many of these other, Jerusalem stone boxes. But he lived on that corner down the road, and Amos and his parents would come to visit Uncle Yosef, who was this kind of renowned man of learning, and depicted rather satirically, not only by Agnon, but particularly by Agnon, as being rather pedantic, being rather full of himself, rather stuffy, rather arrogant. Klausner was the losing candidate in the election for the first president of the State of Israel. He loses to Weizmann. We have up in the library, on some other occasion we can visit there, in Agnon's library. We have a whole collection of his books that he gifted to Agnon. Presumably he had in his library books from Agnon, but despite the veneer of a friendly relationship, there was actually quite a chill that existed between them. Agnon got even by living longer. But when Klausner died, you may be familiar with this well-worn anecdote. When Klausner died, they renamed the street Klausner. Agnon grits his teeth and says, "Can you imagine me having to spend my day living on Rehov Klausner?" To which his neighbor from across the way said, "Would you prefer that Klausner was living on Rehov Agnon?" There's so many other funny anecdotes. There's an anecdote that Agnon told, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. That one day, in those days, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, people didn't have telephones. If you wanted to come see Agnon or come see Klausner, you would just walk out here to Talpiot, which before the 40s wasn't even part of Jerusalem. Right? In many stories, Agnon describes how hard it was to get the bus to run from the center of town all the way out here, to get the mail to come all the way out here. In one rather touching scene, he describes in his story Hasiman, the sign, a story, it's his most clear treatment of the Holocaust. Agnon describes if you wanted to get your neighbor's attention, you didn't call on the phone because people didn't have telephones. You'd go up to the roof of your house and you'd blow a shofar. And your neighbor would know you were calling. So someone comes out to the neighborhood looking for Klausner. He gets to the corner, and he sees a rather distinguished man. I imagine him wearing tweed. He has a goatee, he's sitting on the veranda, smoking his pipe. And he says to him, "Slicha, Adoni, ani mechapes Dr. Klausner." "Pardon me, sir, I'm looking for Dr. Klausner." The man gives a quizzical look up in the air and says, Eneni makir. I do not know a Dr. Klausner. Okay. He walks another 100 feet down the road. He sees Agnon out in front, working in the garden. He says, "Excuse me, Mr. Agnon, do you know where I can find Dr. Klausner?" So Agnon says, "You see the fellow, pipe, tweed, corner, veranda? You were just talking to him." The man goes back and says, "Excuse me, but Mr. Agnon tells me that you are Dr. Klausner." To which Klausner responded, "Excuse me, it's Professor Klausner." Now, whether the story is true or not, it tells us more about what Agnon thought about Klausner. In Agnon's novel, Shira, a novel that Agnon worked on for many years and could not bring it to conclusion in his lifetime, but which was published posthumously a year after his death. There's a character. It's a novel that takes place in and around the Hebrew University in those early years. It's one of these. There is this notion of the university novel. In other words, any academics here? Yeah. So you understand why academic politics is so ripe for satire, right? And as if you saw the movie Footnote, the idea that somebody really might be prepared to harry-carry themselves over a mention in a footnote is, you know those witty bon mots of Kissinger. Kissinger said he was in Harvard for all those years, and he left Harvard to join the Nixon White House. So he said, "Yeah, I had to get out of Harvard. The politics were killing me." And then he also apparently said that in politics, in academia, the politics are so bitter precisely because the stakes are so small. So this is what's satirized in the novel. The novel itself is a rather sprawling. It's really about a portrait of an academic, Herbst, midlife. It's a portrait of somebody going through a midlife crisis, working away, trying to finish that last footnote, to finish the magnum opus with which he'll achieve tenure. And the senior member of his department, this Professor Bachlam, who happens to live on a street right here in this neighborhood, is kind of holding him back. And there's a chapter that was left out of the manuscript that Agnon, even though Agnon didn't finish the book, Agnon marked it as, kind of with an X, because he realized it was way too over the top. And then, of course, after he died, this chapter, which had been excised from the novel, was published from the archives. And then in the new edition of Shira that came out in English a couple of years ago, so I translated this archive chapter as an appendix to the book. But it's this rather satirical look of the visit to Bachlam, who everyone understood was Klausner. It begins, you don't have this in front of you, it begins, "The visit with Professor Bachlam went well. He opened the door with a cold greeting, nor was he particularly cordial towards Mrs. Herbst." You know what the name Herbst means? No, not spring. Lehefech. Fall, autumn. Herbst is German, like from the same root as harvest. Herbst, harvest, right? In other words, it means the fall, the autumn. And it's literally a portrait of middle age, right? Somebody turning into the autumn of their years, right? So he greeted her. So they come to the door. Bachlam greets them with a cold greeting, and quite right that he should offer a cold greeting, for Herbst had never praised a single one of Bachlam's books, and he'd author over 60 books, and each and every one deserved 60-fold measure of praise. And besides, Herbst was unliked by him, like all the other academics who are unliked by Bachlam. Some were unliked for one reason, and others for some other reason, but all of these reasons, the bottom line was the unspoken praise they should have showered on him instead of remaining silent. And then there's a scene where they come for tea on Shabbat afternoon. And then other guests come for tea. And Bachlam is holding forth and he's showing everyone all of his... He asks one of the guests to stand up and to spread their arms wide. And they say, "You see that? Go stand up against the bookshelf And on the bookshelf are the off-prints of all of his articles. And the span of their hands, spread eagle, is not wide enough to contain the length of the shelf that contain all of the off-prints of all of the academic articles he's written. And then these other guests come, but they're just neighbors, meaning they're not academics. And he says, allow me to introduce you. This is Mrs. Herbst. And this is Mr. Adjunct Professor Dr. Herbst. In other words, this holding on to the different academic type to indicate exactly what his rank is and how lowly he is and how he's holding it back. So everyone understood this was a portrait of Klausner, who young Amos and his parents come to visit almost every Shabbat. In A Tale of Love and Darkness, there's a scene which for some reason in the English it's chapter 11, in the Hebrew it's chapter 12. The translator took out certain material in the translation and rearranged some of the chapters. So if you're looking for it in the Hebrew, it's chapter 12, but in English it's chapter 11. This is what you have in front of you, the page of the staple. Amos describes, sometimes after we had taken our leave of Uncle Joseph and Aunt Sipora, if it wasn't too late, we would linger for 20 minutes or half an hour to call on the neighbors across the road. We would sneak, as it were, to the Agnon's house, without telling Uncle and Auntie where we were going, so as not to upset them, because you understand there was this chilly relationship, and if they thought they were sneaking out early to go visit the less than beloved neighbors, it would cause problems. I'm going to skip a drop to the next paragraph. The Agnon's house was set in a garden, surrounded by cypresses, but to be on the safe side, it was built with its back to the street, as though hiding its face in the garden. Now, does that describe the exact makeup here? Where's the entrance? The entrance to the house is over on this side. We're now in the back of the house. But that is the only way to describe the house as it was in the 40s and 50s. Because in the 40s and 50s, this street was a dead end. This was the last house. So all of this over here, Agnon describes that when they moved into the house in 1931. You can see on that placard over there behind you, right? You see there's a picture of Agnon hoeing the ground where he plants the tree. That life-size billboard it's exactly in situ. That's exactly where he was standing when the photograph was taken. And you can see the whole area is just wide open, rocky hilltop. There was nothing here, no trees, no other houses, there was nothing surrounding, and he describes looking out in this direction, you could see all the way down, not to the American Embassy, but to the Dead Sea. And looking out, he says if you go up to the library from the window that looks in this direction, you could see all the way, you could see Har HaBayit, you could see the Temple Mount, because none of those trees and none of those buildings had yet been built up to block the view. So when this street was a dead end and this house was the last one on it, the front of the house was over there, not where you entered from this side, and the back of the house was here, so the entrance to the house was concealed in the back. And this was done intentionally, of course, because we're coming up on 90 years, this summer, next month, is the 90th anniversary of the Hafraot Tarpat, the 1929 Arab uprising, in which many people, of course, were killed, particularly in Hebron. But not this house, the Agnon's house, when Agnon first moves to the neighborhood in 1927, they live in a rented home, a building that no longer exists, but it was presumably somewhere down the block. And in 1929, the house is marauded, it's broken into. His library, which had already been destroyed in fire in 1924 in Germany and rebuilt in the 3 years since he'd returned, his library is largely damaged again, largely destroyed again, because the marauders pulled all the books off the shelves, turned on all the faucets in the house, flooded the place, destroying the library and property and other things. As Agnon's wife and children were not at home, they'd already kind of left because Jerusalem, or at least this part of the edge of town, was not considered terribly safe. He was at home working, and as they're busting in the back door, he's shoving his manuscript pages into a suitcase or into a valise to run out and escape with his life and manuscripts, having lost 2 nearly completed manuscripts in the fire a number of years earlier. So the house, this description of the house is historically accurate. Hiding its face in the garden. All you could see from the street were 4 or 5 slit windows. You entered through a gate concealed among the cypresses, walked along a paved path by the side of the house, climbed 4 or 5 steps, rang the bell at the white door, and waited for the door to be opened and for you to be invited to turn to your right and to climb the half-dark steps to Mr. Agnon's study, from which you reached a large paved rooftop terrace that looked out onto the Judean desert and the hills of Moab. Or else to turn left to the small, rather cramped living room whose windows looked into the empty garden. There was never full daylight in the Agnon's house. It was always a kind of twilight, with a faint smell of coffee and pastries. Perhaps because we visited just before the end of Shabbat toward evening, and they would not switch on the electric light until the 3 stars at least had appeared at the window. Or perhaps the electric light was on, but it was that yellow, miserly Jerusalem electricity. Or maybe Mr. Agnon was trying to economize. Or there was a power failure and the only light came from the paraffin lamp. I can still remember the half-darkness. In fact, I can almost touch it. The grills on the windows seemed to imprison and accentuate it. The reason for it is hard to tell now, and it may have been hard to tell even then. Whatever the reason, whenever Mr. Agnon stood up to pull a book from the shelves that looked like a crowded congregation of worshippers dressed in shabby dark clothes, his form did not cast 1 shadow, but 2 or 3 or even more. That is the way his image was engraved on my childhood memory, and that is the way I remember him today. A man swaying in the half-light, with 3 or 4 separate shadows around him as he walked, in front of him, to his right, behind him, above, and to his feet. This idea of which he now develops metaphorically of Agnon as someone who casts many shadows. Not cast a giant shadow, you all remember that film, not cast a giant shadow, but cast many shadows. And for an author who's trying to, both Agnon and young Oz, who already sees himself as aspiring to be a great author, the idea of casting multiple shadows in your writing is a very great desideratum. And he develops this metaphor of Agnon, the shadow caster. He goes on to say, at the bottom of this page, in the spring of 1965, when my first book, Where the Jackals Howl, in Hebrew it's called Artsot Hatan, I sent a copy with some trepidation to Agnon, with an inscription on the flyleaf. Agnon sent me a nice letter in reply and said some things about my book. Now, it just so happens that I have that book right here. These are the books that Oz, if you'd like, you can gather. I'm not going to pass them around, you understand. These are the books that Oz gifted to Agnon that we have here. And we have the inscriptions. You know, you can't do this anywhere else. I mean, I could have given this talk elsewhere. Like if you wanted to invite me to your shul, I could have come and given a talk. I'd be glad to do it. But I couldn't do this. Imagine like you go give a lecture at the Louvre, and you say, well, let me just pull the Mona Lisa off the shelf. We can get a. So here in this March 5th, 1965, Oz writes, I'll read it in Hebrew, then I'll give a loose translate. Mi'imi Rivka Klausner Zal lamadati le'ehov et sipurecha ahavat nefesh. From my mother, Rivka Klausner of blessed memory, I learned to love your books deeply. Umi avi Yehuda Aryeh Klausner yebod l'chaim aruchim lamadati le'red ma'at le'omkam. From my father Yehuda, he should live a long life. I learned a bit to plumb their depths. Umi atzmi lamadati shelo lagat bevilon shematach ha'oman v'shelo lahatriach alecha ba'ahavati she'ani ohev et sifrecha. And for myself, I understood not to transgress, not to trespass, not to literally to touch the screen that the author puts between himself and his audience. I learned not to trespass that out of the real desire I had to tell you how much I love your writing, how much it means to me. Meaning, he's being ironic here, because that's precisely what he's doing. al shesifrecha hitivu imi b'sha'ot marot. And the reason that I love your work so much is because that they did good for me. They were kind to me, your books, in very sorrowful times. With great respect and love, Amos Oz. And then the next year, when his first novel comes out, he writes, L'shai Agnon, Asher Natan li, Tirza Mintz, Vet Blumanacht, Vet Herschel, Vet Yitzchak, all the great characters of his works, right? Tirza from In the Prime of Her Life, and Bluma from Simple Story, and Herschel, also from Simple Story, and Yitzchak Kumer from Tmol Shel Shom, Asher Hayu Imi B'Shot Shel Etzev, who were with me in my times of sorrow. Ba'ahava Amos Oz. Now, what are these times of sorrow that he's talking about? So, of course, he's talking about the suicide of his mother. And Agnon, you could go back to this page, what Agnon tells him, what Agnon writes to him in his letter of thanks for receiving the books and the dedication, what you wrote to me about your book conjured up the image of your late mother. I recall her once, some 15 or 16 years ago, bringing me a book from your father. You may have been with her. She stood upon the doorstep, and her words were few, but her face remained with me in all its grace and innocence, honesty, for many days. Yours sincerely, Shai Agnon. And then skip a drop. My mother used to say about Agnon, that man sees and understands a lot. And once she said, he may not be such a good man, but at least he knows bad from good. And he also knows we don't have much choice. Oz, besides writing his short stories and his novels, he was also involved, like so many other Hebrew authors who usually need to have a day job. Right? There are very few, even the greatest authors, who can support themselves full-time as authors. Agnon was, of course, very fortunate and exceptional in this way because of his relationship with his patron, Mr. Shokin. From a young age, he was able to dedicate himself fully to writing without the need to worry about making a living on the side. But many of the authors, at least until they reach a certain point, this is true for Oz and for Appelfeld and for Aleph Bet Yoshua, and they all do something else, usually teaching. And there's a tradition here in the universities that an author of note can get a position, can even get a chair teaching literature in the universities, even though they don't have a PhD, on the basis of their achievement as an author. But the assumption is that they do have to do they do have to produce a certain amount of scholarship nonetheless. So all of these authors also taught in the universities. Oz taught for many years in Beersheba. He was the inaugural occupant of the Agnon chair in Hebrew literature at Beersheba University, at the Ben Gurion University in the Negev. But he produced a number of works of literary criticism, both of Hebrew criticism and of general literature. One of these works is dedicated to Agnon. In Hebrew it's called Shtikat HaShamayim, Agnon Mishtomeim Al Elokim. And it's been translated in a rather, I don't want to speak badly of another translator, but in a rather problematic translation. It's available in English as Silence of the Heavens. And it's about Agnon's attitude towards religion. I must say that when the book came out, it received rather roundly panned in the reviews. Not just by religious folk that took exception to secular Oz's reading of Agnon. He basically makes the claim that Agnon was something of a sheep in wolf's clothing, a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Well, yes, except in other words, here, the religious guys wear the dark, right? So, in other words, that Agnon is really a kind of closeted apicorus, or Agnon's attitude towards religion and to God is rather ambivalent, much more than people generally understand. And his work should be interpreted through the lens of being a critique on faith and religion. And it's a reading principally of three of Agnon's most significant and well-loved and well-read works, Tehillah, Sipur Pashut, a simple story, and Smol Shulshom, his great novel of the second Aliyah. It was particularly the chapter on Tehillah, in which he accuses that, right, those of you that will come to the play will see exactly how righteous and kind and graceful and etc. she was, but he makes a kind of claim that Tehillah was a closeted rebel who was guilty on one plane or another, if not in the strict halachic sense, then at least morally guilty of the three cardinal sins: murder, idolatry, and illicit sexual relations. That was a claim that a lot of respondents to the book had trouble with. But in the introduction to the work, where he lays out the theme, he says the following. You don't have this on the sheets. And what he says about Agnon, you don't need to be Sigmund Freud to understand that he might actually be speaking about himself. He says, we must recognize the trauma that made Agnon what he is. I'm going to substitute the name Agnon for Oz. We must recognize the trauma that made Agnon what he is. Every true writer becomes a writer because of a profound trauma experienced in youth or childhood. And if we hedge our statement with a myriad of reservations, with all kinds of although and nevertheless, perhaps we might venture to say that the flight of the narrator's imagination is as high as the depth of his wound. Or in other words, the force of his scream is as intense as his pain. Indeed, the title of one of Agnon's short stories is Lefi Hatzar Haschar, Lefum Tzara Agra, in the language of Pirkei Avot, according to the reward is the pain. Nachon. So this is the translator's mistake here. Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. What they write here is the reward matches the pain. I misread it. The reward matches the pain.
We didn't hear the comment.
I said it wrong. He corrected me. You know, it's like you go to shul. Why do people go to shul?
Correct.
Because the Balkor is going to make a mistake, and you can maybe something exciting will happen. You can correct him. So that's what happened. Yes, I hear you. There are people who suffer a trauma and don't become writers, but instead rather saints or murderers or whatever. But I did say with a myriad of reservations. Perhaps we may say that the trauma, the rift in Agnon's soul, was deeper and more painful than those. Hence the creative tension, the vigor of the sources of energy, the depth of the torments are of a different order altogether. For Agnon's pain and the distress of his generation were malignant, incurable, insoluble, inextricable. All of this he could have said about himself. What might it have meant to be a rather sensitive soul, young boy, 12 years old, in Jerusalem of the 1950s? Your mother commits suicide, your father is distant. After his mother's suicide, by the age of 14, he leaves home to go off and live on kibbutz. Can you imagine this? What? Yes, people did this, but can we imagine? Right? It's almost unimaginable, right? In other words, this is not the normal existence that we recognize today, right? Now he explicitly describes what he thinks the trauma. Agnon had a rather happy childhood. So in that regard, they're not the same. Agnon had parents that doted on him and supported him and praised him. But this is Agnon's. He says, this is Agnon's trauma. Either there is one who hears our prayers, or there is not. There is justice and judge, din v'dayan, or there is not. All the acts of our forefathers are meaningful, or they are not. And while we're at it, is there meaning to our own acts, or isn't there? And is there any meaning in any act at all? What is sin? What is guilt? What is righteousness? In all these, Agnon is neither guide nor model, but he and his heroes run around from one extreme to another in dread and despair. And then he continues, with all that, the sensitive reader will hear a muffled scream when reading Agnon, an open wound. For there is a genuine creator here. This is the source of Agnon's true creative genius. And even though I and other critics disagree with where he takes it in his readings of the stories, I accept the essential diagnosis, that Agnon's great themes are this tension between the old world and the new, and tradition, modernity, and faith lived in a world where faith is a given, to faith in a world where it has to be earned or abandoned. And these are essential themes in Agnon, and Amos Oz is correct in identifying them. But these works aside, interestingly, in this book, which he dedicates to Agnon, he does not discuss the work that he, Amos Oz, called the bedrock of modern Hebrew literature, or maybe even more precisely, he called it the birthing stool on which came forth all of modern Hebrew literature. And that's a long short story, or a novella of Agnon's, called Bidmi Yameha, or in English it's translated as In the Prime of Her Life. This is the other sheet you have with the opening of the story on it. Aleph Bet Yehoshua, who no less than Oz, they were close friends and colleagues and probably competitors. Like for the title, who's the greatest Israeli novelist? So Yehoshua, in describing the influence, and all of the writers of that generation felt the shadow of Agnon, these multiple shadows that he cast. They all felt the shadow of Agnon on their own writing, and they all wrestled with it, and they all tried to, at first, imitate, and then later to push back and find their own voice and their own style. But Yehoshua says, if I had to explain Agnon's literary genius in just one sentence, I would say it's his ability to bring to life the subconscious of his characters. This is also the reason we are drawn not just to read his works, but to attempt to interpret them. Many readings of Bidmi Yameha, In the Prime of Her Life, support this idea. The story has been interpreted through the lens of feminism. It's been interpreted through a Freudian interpretation, from a Zionist interpretation, a postmodern interpretation, a midrashic interpretation. Right? There is no reading of this that this story won't support, which doesn't mean that every reading leads you to truth or to insight. Right? In other words, the value of any reading is it profitable? Is it profitable to read this work through the prism of postmodernism or post-Zionism, or through that kind of work of ferreting out every biblical and rabbinic source in order to try to see the building blocks, the DNA that Agnon built his story with? Right? C.S. Lewis, writing in a different context, once said that I could show you the bones and marrow with which I prepared your soup, but it wouldn't make the experience of eating it any tastier. Perhaps quite the contrary. Right? In other words, I can take it, or in the words of that other joke, if you dissect a frog, you learn a lot about a frog, but afterwards you don't have a frog. Right? In other words, we can unpack everything and show, and this is a type of scholarship, to do that kind of dissecting of a story, to peel back every layer, to find the bedrock of the verse and the Mishnah and that it's built upon. But sometimes the aesthetic of the story as a whole gets lost, or at least has to be reconstructed afterwards. Oz said about In the Prime. He says in Sipur Alav V'Choshech, but in one of the sections that's only in Hebrew and for some reason was left out of the English translation, Oz says about this story, Bidmi Yameha, In the Prime of Her Life, from the day I discovered In the Prime of Her Life at around the age of 15, I compared myself, or I identified with, the protagonist of the story, a young woman named Tirza Mintz. Now, who's read or who remembers In the Prime of Her Life? Some of you studied it with me here, so we'll do a quick summary. in the prime of her life is unique. In all of Agnon's 23 volumes, it's the only story with a female narrator. Agnon has many wonderful female characters. On the contrary, in many of Agnon's stories, it's the women who wear the pants in the story. It's the women who are dominant, it's the women who take action, and it's the men sometimes who are passive and are acted upon. But the narrator, in almost every story, is a character, whether the first person narrator is a character in the story, or he's standing outside of the story telling us about something that happened. The narrator is a character that we imagine to be Agnon himself. And very many people, not a week goes by that I don't correct someone who says the following: Agnon said XYZ. Excuse me, Agnon did not say that. The narrator of his story said it. You can't presume anything at all about what Agnon said or felt or believed based upon the words he puts into the mouth of his character. Now, there's a good reason people, even the most significant literary scholars and interpreters of Agnon make this mistake. I myself have made this mistake. There's a very good reason people make this mistake. Because he wants you to believe that the narrator is him. Sometimes the narrator's name is Shmuel Yosef. And he lives in a house in Talpiot. And he makes his living as a writer. And he's married to a woman named Esther. And he has 2 small children. And he came from a town called Buchach, right? But it's not him. Right? Anymore. I mean, I'm beginning to feel after all these years, so many of you have heard me so many times, we could just press play, or I can just tell the punchline without having to do the setup of the joke, right? But many times I've mentioned Philip Roth, who suffered from the same thing. And if you don't know what I'm referring to, ask Jay. It's in his notebook. He can show it to you, the whole spiel about Philip. But Philip Roth said that he wrote, specifically is referring to Portnoy's complaint. Don't tell my mother I read it. He wrote a novel in the form of a confession, and people confused it for a confession in the form of a novel. And even in his books like the one about Limburg, The Plot Against America, right? The character's name is Philip Roth, but it's not an autobiography. It's a work of fiction, right? In the prime of her life, we meet an entirely different narrator, a young woman. And interestingly, those that read Agnon in Hebrew know the degree to which he was, or those that translate Agnon from Hebrew to English, amongst us here, Rabbi Perkins, know the degree to which Agnon was writing in a kind of Agnonized rabbinic Hebrew. But interestingly, when he writes a story that's coming out of the mouth of a young woman in Buchach or Shibush in the first decade of the 20th century, right, whose familiarity with rabbinic sources would have been less, he writes it in a much more biblical register. Because she would have known the Hebrew of the Bible, but she would not have learned Mishnah and Gemara. So he adapts the register of the Hebrew to match the narrator that he's created for this story, who's telling her first person story. Now, her story is quite an interesting one. Her mother dies rather young, leaving her an only child, a young girl. Maybe she's 14, 15, I forget when the story opens. Her father is beside himself with grief. And cutting a long story short, she discovers her mother's diary, or she's given her mother's diary by a rather manipulative character in the story. And through reading her dead mother's diary, she discovers her father was not her mother's first love. There was another. Someone named Akavia Mazal. Akavia is an Aramaic. Akavia is an Aramaic name, Professor? Sort of. Akavia is like an Aramaic version of Yaakov. Yaakov means what? Well, heal, but also means to what?
Supplant.
To supplant, right? To overtake, to bend. Right? V'haya ahakov lamishor, says the pasuk in Yeshayahu, from which Agnon takes the title of one of his first important works. Right? The crooked shall be made straight. Right? So Akavya Mazal is a character whose luck has gone crooked. The train has come off the track. Akavya Mazal was the first love of her mother, but her grandparents, her mother's parents, forbade the shidduch because Akavya Mazal was a poor nothing. He was worse than a poor nothing. He was a teacher. I say as a teacher. I'm allowed to say that. You can't say that.
I'll say this as a teacher.
Yes, you'll second that motion. And instead they marry her off to Mr. Mintz. What does Mintz mean? Can you hear it? The jingle and jangle of coins, right? She marries somebody who's a solid middle-class balabatish type character because that's what but the mother apparently never recovered and dies at a young age. She has heart disease, but you can understand the narrator's description. She has heart disease might also mean that she dies of a broken heart. Now, Akavya Mazal, this poor school teacher, also never marries. And Tirza gets this idea. Tirza's name means, what is Tirza? We have in this week's Parsha. Tirza is one of the Benot Tzlov. What's Tirza? To want, from the Lashon of Ratzon. Right? Some of you have been here enough years, you should know some Hebrew. She's an entity of desire. She wants to bend everyone around her to her will, to her desire. And she orchestrates the circumstances so that Akavya Mazal will marry her, even though he's old enough to be her father. Right? I mean, in some way, there's no implication that her mother had a sexual relationship, or it's certainly no implication that they'd had an affair after she was married to Mintz. But Tirza understands that in a kind of different universe, he should have been my father. Now, I've told that story. Who remembers the story that I've told you about my father's girlfriend? You've heard this before? Okay, I'll tell it again, even though Jay knows it. And the other Jay knows it, he just forgot that he knew it. When I was a little kid, maybe, 7, 8 years old, we were in a store, and we're online in a department store, and, my mother's got, 2 kids in tow, and there's another woman with her kid or 2 in front of us, and, there's that moment where they recognize that they know each other. Oh, hi, how are you? What have you been up to? Where are you living now? And this is your daughter? Yeah, this is your son? Okay, bye, see you, regards. So the woman pays and leaves, and my mother turns to me and says, "That's the woman your father didn't marry." Meaning, apparently, I hadn't known this. My father only had one other serious girlfriend before my mother. My parents got married quite young. My father had only one other serious relationship before my mother, and it was this woman. You're a little kid. That kept me up at night. Right? Because first of all, you're a little kid, you think your parents were like hatched from an egg the moment you were born. Right? The idea that they had a life of their own, that they had a romance of their own, you just don't want to think about it. It's not, right? And, say, wait, well, what would have happened if my father had married that woman? Would she be my mother now? I don't know. I wouldn't exist. This is the kind of thought that, you're little, it keeps you up at night. So this is what Tirza Mintz experiences. She realizes there's been something right now. This is a typically Agnonian theme. This idea that none of Agnon's love stories end happily ever after. Right? The whole very idea of Agnon, of agunot, not agunot in this colloquial sense of women whose husbands won't give the divorce, But agunot in the classical sense of love that's rendered asunder and can't somehow work it out. You understand, in the classical sense, in agunah is the exact opposite of how we use the term today. Right? Today, it's a mistake, right, to call the women of today. I mean, there are some classical agunot, but thankfully they're very rare. The classical agunah is husband goes off to business, never comes back. Maybe the ship went down. Who knows? Right? The contemporary aguna, with quotation marks, we know where the husband is. Right? And if he'd only do the right thing, she'd be freed of him. She can't stand him. The classical aguna is the mirror emotional image. Every day, she's looking by the window. Every time there's a knock at the door, she thinks, maybe it's him, he's come back. She longs for him, she loves him. Right? And that's why Agnon chooses Agunot as the title of that story, from which he then takes the pen name Agnon, right? Because that's the theme he's dealing with, both on on the level of the plot of many of these love stories, but also on a national plot. Because if we use the rabbinic metaphor of God and the Jewish people as a husband and wife, well, we've been Agunot. God didn't divorce the Jewish people, but we've been separated. Why? Because we haven't been living together in our marital home, Eretz Yisrael, these 2,000 years. And what does it mean, he begins to think at the beginning of the 20th century, for this Jewish national return to the bridal chamber? That's what the land of Israel is meant to be in the rabbinic metaphor. So no Agnon story ends happily ever after. There are all these stories of igun, right? Of two people who are chained together mystically, spiritually, emotionally, but somehow can't find the way to get it together. So Tirza has this idea that maybe in the next generation we can fix what happened previously. Right? This is the plot in Simple Story. What did we say? We read Simple Story in the fall? Oh, no, we did The Crooked Shall Be Made Straight. But we did Simple Story last year. Right? And remember Simple Story? Baruch Meyer and Muriel are supposed to get married, but also because of money, he leaves her and marries Cyril. Right? There's Muriel and Cyril. And Cyril is a little less pleasant, but she's got money. And then in the next generation, each of them has children. Herschel is the son of Cyril and Baruch Meyer. And Blumenacht is the orphaned daughter of Muriel and her husband. So she comes to work as a housemaid. Right? And Herschel kind of has this idea, in some ways she's like my twin. In some ways she's like my sister, because had my father married her mother, right, the same idea. I mean, he understands, this is the early 20th century, they understand this is not how genetics works. Right? He doesn't actually think, but psychically there's a bond between us. And if we get together, that will repair the rift that was caused in the previous generation, when some foul deed was done to mess up true love. So Tirza has this idea, she's going to manipulate the circumstances so that Akavya will marry her. She does this by either pretending to be ill or actually making herself ill, so that they will think, just like Leah, the mother, had to marry Mintz because she was ill, right? And he had the money to save her and to treat her and to whatever. Because you can't, if you're ill, if you have tsaros, so you also have financial needs. And if you have financial needs, you can't marry a poor teacher, because he won't be able to take care of you. So her parents marry her off to the middle-class merchant who can take care of her. And he does take care of her, and he does love her. So Tirza thinks that if she'll be sick, lovesick for Akavya, she'll die without him, he'll be forced to marry her, and then we will fix things. And the final scene, which is typically Agnonianly ambivalent, has her at home, pregnant, waiting their first child, with her husband and her father who's visiting, sitting at the table, and she looks at her husband and she looks at her father and she realizes she married her father. Right? She married not just a man her father's age, and it's a case of, well, it depends on how you interpret the story, but most read it as, careful what you wish for. And when the novel ends, we discover that what we have been reading is the memoir of Tirza Mintz. The whole story is the story as she records it in her memoir, which makes you question how reliable, in her diary, how reliable a narrator is she? You know what an unreliable narrator is. An unreliable narrator is one who causes you to have to go back and reread the whole story beginning to end. Right? You know, like Catcher in the Rye. When you get to the end of Catcher in the Rye, you realize that Holden Caulfield has been narrating his whole story to you from inside a nut house, an insane asylum. And then you say, oh, I better go back and reread it. Because that knowledge that you gain at the end has to cast an understanding on everything that you didn't understand the first time through. Agnon, of course, very famously once said, Oz actually quotes it here, that any story not worth reading twice probably wasn't worth reading the first time. In his reading of B'dmi Yameha, in this Hebrew essay, Oz says the following. In order to obtain what she wants, Tirza makes her illness into a weapon, as if to say, if you do not give me a kavya, you will lose me the way... No, this is I'm reading this. If you don't give me a kavya, you will lose me the way you've lost my mother. The link between love and illness here is subtle and dialectical. Tirza's mother was sickly and was therefore kept from a kavya, whereas Tirza, by falling very ill, wins him. But Tirza's love recalls the fire of Heraclitus. Her victory is her defeat. Tirza's married life is chilly, either because over the years the romantic idol has become a polite, considerate, middle-aged gentleman, or because this is what he always had been, outside mothers' and daughters' romantic fantasies. In other words, she falls in love not with this middle-aged man who's old enough to be her father. She falls in love with the image of this man that she comes to know through reading her mother's now 15, 18-year-old diary of what he was then. Ask yourselves, if you were to find, your true love's description of you, in the first romantic weeks of your courtship, and then compare that description to who you are now, how much of an overlap and how much of a dissonance might there be? To Tirza, who tries to be her mother's identical twin, her husband begins to look like a twin of her own father. So much so that towards the end of the story, she even actually mixes them up. And this theme of twins and doppelgangers runs throughout the story. Of people getting mixed up. There is a set of twins. You know this idea of the doppelganger? That in the world there's someone who looks just like you. There's a what do they call it? A superstition. A superstition that if you encounter your doppelganger, right? If you walk into the supermarket and there's somebody who looks just like you, it's a bad omen, or it's a sign that you're about to die. And there are all types of at least fantastical stories or agadic stories of people encountering their doppelgangers and then coming to a bad end. It's said that Lincoln had an experience like this, right? Whether or not the story is true, the fact that there's a kind of folk tale about it says something about it. Yeah, maybe both of them die. I don't know. So they're these they're literally twin brothers, and one of them they don't live near each other. So one of them is a character in the story, and his twin comes to visit, and he's in the living room, and the little kid, the toddler of the man whose house it is, goes up to his uncle, honestly mistaking him for his father, and when he discovers that it's not his father, it becomes horrified. Now, this happens all the time. It happens to me all the time. You're walking home from shul, right? And there's somebody holding you my kids are already older. This doesn't happen with my kids. But there's a little kid, like a toddler, holding onto your pants leg by the knee. And you can get halfway home before you realize it's not your kid, right? And then, because to a little kid, we all look the same from the knee down, right? So the kid looks up and realizes, you're not my Abba, and they scream, Right? So that kind of mixing up and twinning and etc., and this idea that she wants to take the place of her mother and ends up, the whole thing. Did anybody see there's an Israeli film? When I taught the story here a while back, we actually watched the film. You can see it on YouTube. If you can't find it, email me and I'll send you the link. There's an Israeli film with English subtitles made of this story. No, so there's also, in the Khan, there's also a play based on Dmei Meha, which I like less than the Tehillah. No, altogether, I thought the interpretation of the play was not authentic to the story. In the play, did anybody see the Dmei Meha at the Khan? So there's another Agnon play running at the same theater called Dmei Meha, but there Tirza is portrayed as being insane. She's not insane. She's manipulative, but she's not insane. And by depicting her as insane, it changes the whole basis of the story. The Tehillah play, which some of you will see next week, is extremely loyal to the spirit of Agnon's story. So in the movie version of B'Dmei Meha, which is set instead of being set in 1909, it's set in 2009. And instead of being set in Galicia, it's set in Israel. For reasons that might have had as much to do with budget as with artistic choices. You understand it's easier to film a contemporary movie than a set piece where you have to recreate a lost world. So in the movie, the two twin brothers, in the wedding scene, it's absent in the story, but it's a very clever piece of interpretation. At the Tish, where they're getting ready before the wedding, the two brothers are the witnesses on the ketubah, the two twin brothers. Now, those of you that are familiar with the halacha know you can't have brothers, neither twin brothers nor non-twin brothers or any close relatives as edim, which I took to mean I think that was a deliberate choice on the part of the filmmakers. It was a way of saying, not as a halachic statement, as an artistic statement, as an interpretive statement. It was a way of saying there's something pasul, there's something invalid in this wedding. I've been meaning actually all these years to ask the producer if this interpretation is correct. Oz goes on to say, the motif of identical twins appears again and again in the story, filling it with confusions of identity, both large and small, trivial and symbolic, comic and tragic. Every character seemingly embodies someone else. At the beginning of the story, even before we get to know who loves whom, several incidents of mistaken or misleading identity occur. But the significance will become known to the reader only at the end of the story. The opening contract with the reader of In the Prime of Her Life demands, among other things, that the reader go back to the beginning after reading the whole story. So now you have the story. Take a look at the story on the other page. I would just say we have a recording of Agnon himself reading the opening lines of the story. So you see the story that begins, my mother died in the prime of her life. So listen to, you can follow along in the English. Listen, it's on this sheet without a staple. Okay, but you can just listen.
בדמי ימיה מתה אמי, כבר 30 שנה ושנה הייתה אמי במותה. מעט ורעים היו ימי שני חייה. כל היום ישבה בבית, ומן הבית לא יצאה. רעיותיה ושכנותיה לא באו לבקרה, וגם אבי לא הקדיש את קרואיו. דוממת ביתנו ביגונו, דלתיו לזר לא נפתחו.
Shalom, Gershom Shalom once said, listening to Agnon read a story, he was referring to a different story, but it's true for this one as well. Listening to Agnon read a story is like listening to someone chant the Haftarah. You can hear the biblical cadence, you can hear the heaviness of the story. Bidmi yameha meita imi. In the prime, my mother died in the prime of her life. She was barely 31 years old. And it's in the Hebrew, he gives it the biblical rhythm. 30 years and a year she was. Ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shnei chayeha. Few and harsh were the days of her life. She sat at home the entire day and never stirred from within. Her friends and neighbors did not visit, nor did my father welcome guests. Our house stood hushed in sorrow. Its doors did not open to a stranger. Lying on her bed, my mother spoke scarcely a word. But when she did speak, it was as though limpid wings had spread forth and led me to the hall of blessing. How I loved her voice. Often I would open her door just to hear her ask, Miba, who's there? The title of Oz's essay on the story is Miba, who's there? I was still a child. Sometimes she rose from her bed to sit by the window. She would sit by the window dressed in white. She always wore white. Once a relative of my father's was called into town, and seeing my mother, took her for a nurse, for her clothes misled him, and he did not realize it was she who was the patient. Her illness, a heart ailment, bowed her life down. Every summer the doctors would send her to the hot springs, but she would turn back shortly after leaving, for she said her longing gave her no peace, and once again she would sit by the window or lie by the bed. Her longing for who? Her daughter? We don't know. Well, we don't know anything. In other words, forget what I told you. I ruined the ending, right? Forget what I already told you, but imagine the story from the beginning. Who is she longing for? What is the heart ailment? Right? You don't know enough yet to know. If this is your first read and you're a blank slate, you don't yet know enough to ask these questions. She's sitting by the window. Who is she looking out for at the window? That biblical image of sitting by the window comes from where? Aim Sisra. But it's in other words, not for this kind of bloodthirsty warrior, but the idea of sitting by the window is the woman anticipating the return of the loved one. My father began to ply his trades less and less. He no longer left for Germany, where as a bean merchant, he had, right, in other words, Akavia Mazal, he's a teacher, but he's also a poet. There's something romantic about him. And instead of marrying the man she loves, she marries in other words, like literally, he makes him a bean counter. I hope there are no accountants here. Are there any accountants here? Bookkeepers? Anyone? No offense. Right? But in other words, it's not the most romantic profession to be a bean merchant. He had traveled year after year to deal with his clients. In those days and at that time, he forgot the ways of the world. Returning home at dusk, he would sit by my mother's bed, his left hand tucked behind his head, and her right hand held in his own. And every so often, she would lean forward and kiss his hand. Now, this is an inversion of a verse in Shir HaShirim, right? Smolo tachat leroshi v'yimino titchabkeni. Right? In other words, the image of the two lovers, in other words, he's lying like this, and his left hand is out like this, and she's lying here with her head on his left arm, and his right arm is around her, holding onto her. A rather intimate, nearly erotic portrait. So here we're meant to understand the reference to the biblical lovers of Shir HaShirim, but it's not parallel exactly. What does Oz say? There are no fewer than 3 confusions of identity in these opening lines. Actually, I think there's more. Number 1, Miba, who has come? Now, his mother is sick in bed. She's quite literally on her deathbed. The door opens and she says, who's there? So the daughter who longs for this connection to the mother. And in the mother's absence, in the mother's death, she tries to fill it by literally walking in her shoes. So the daughter is hoping that she's calling out, is that you, little Tirza? But no. Later we'll come to understand Miba is her hope that maybe a kavya has come to part from her. Number 2, who is the patient and who is the nurse? Right? Now there's this confused identity. She's confused for being the nurse. And who are the lovers inspired by the Song of Songs? In truth, the relationship between Tirza's parents one of gentle intimacy and melancholic solidarity, has not a whisper of the Song of Songs about it. In other words, they have a tender relationship. The father bitterly mourns her when she's gone. But it was not the fiery romance that Leah had hoped for in her youth. In the scene before us, his left hand is not under her head, and his right hand does not embrace her in the model of Shir Shirim. But it's almost the opposite. His left hand is underneath his own head, and his right hand is not embracing her, but holding hers. Instead of the biblical embrace, there's only a holding of hands, and later, instead of the kiss, there is merely a kiss on the hand. The narrator had told us, Tirza had told us, and it's very interesting, by the way, people that read Agnon and are kind of used to the narrator, he's very clever. He hides the identity of the narrator for a number of pages. It's only a number of pages in that you discover that the narrator, whose mother is dying, is not the young boy version of Agnon that we know from so many stories. Stories like Hamit Pachat, the kerchief, for example, but is a young woman, a girl. And think about it, in Hebrew you have to be even extra clever to write around all the gendered language. Now, in English it's easier to do, but in Hebrew you have to be careful to not give away through the use of gendered language that it's a woman speaking, so that there's this slow reveal about the identity of the narrator. So when he says Kol Hayom Yashva, when she says Kol Hayom Yashva Bevayit Umin Habayit Lo Yatsa, all day she sat at home, and from our home she did not leave. All day long she sat in the house and did not leave it. Or literally, all day long she sat in the house, out of the house she did not move. There is, in the second clause of the sentence, not a crumb of information not given to us in the first. A hasty style editor might have noted in the margin, in red pen, Mr. Agnon, this is superfluous repetition. It should be deleted. Agnon didn't have editors like that. But somebody, you can understand somebody saying, what do you have to say? She sat at home. What do you have to tell us that she never left home if you tell us she only spent all day sitting at home? But the impact of such a sentence is created by the very fact that it has two equivalent clauses. A facade of stable balance, of equilibrium, of solid structures, covers a social and familial reality whose internal equilibrium is increasingly shaken. The opening lines set before the reader an entrapment. The voice of Tirza, the narrator, her cadenced biblical language, her aesthetic excitement, the elegaic melancholy of her mother's illness and of her father's dedication, along with allusions to the Song of Songs, draw the reader into a veiled emotional mood. They seem to prepare the ground for a story about heartbreak, orphanhood, love, the triumph of emotion over societal rules, class inhibitions. Yet, if we reread, or if read backwards, in the prime of her life reveals that Tirza, having taken for herself what was denied her mother, might have been just a victim of a small intrigue perpetrated by a manipulative family friend. In the end, Tirza is trapped in almost the same spot as her heartbroken mother, meaning she's married to the wrong man. The reader is therefore directed, almost compelled, to return to the opening, to re-examine, as it were, the fine print of the contract. In doing so, the reader may establish that he has not at all been deceived. He might have been merely too hasty in trusting Tirza's voice, not stopping to suspect her in the story, which is strewn from the very beginning with errors and with confused identities, such as the prank with the door. Who caused the mother to repeatedly ask, "Who is there?" Who is there instead of who is here? The mother's name is Leah. The biblical story of Leah is also one of confused identities. Almost to the very last page of her recollections, Tirza makes, as do the other characters, errors of identity both large and small. Leah's soft eyes and her daughter Tirza's eyes and other eyes of the story are incessantly turned to who is there, perhaps because they are almost blind to who is here. So that's a summary of how Oz reads in the prime of her life. Now, I led you down this little experiment, this little reading of Agnon, reading of Oz reading Agnon, because it's a perfect description of how he describes Agnon's own impact on him, or at least the enduring impact. That idea of casting multiple shadows, of what some would say is the author playing games with the reader, but really just drawing him in very closely, him or her very closely, so that you have to wrestle with the plot. So many authors today, they always used to tell authors, show, don't tell. Now so many authors can do, all they can do is tell. They give it all away in the first paragraph. There's no tension. There's no ambiguity. Right? There's no trust in the reader. Right? That if we don't pack it all in on the first page, they won't stick with us. Because, after all, they could be tweeting instead. And it's changed the way we think about the literary arts to our deficit. But the long-term impact of Agnon on a whole generation of writers, and on Oz in particular, can be seen through this way that Oz describes the proper way to read an Agnon story, which then he tried to adapt or adopt in his own writing. And the impact of, now again, the story of a young girl around the same age of a young boy who lost his mother. You don't need to be Sigmund Freud to understand why this story might have had particular resonance for Oz. I mean, he tells us explicitly that he identified with Tirza. Right? He identified with this young child who undergoes the trauma of the death of the mother and spends the rest of her life trying to repair, trying to fix. But in some ways, the whole thing is a comedy of errors, because you can't go back again. You can't fix the past. Right? The past, this is the great theme of Agnon, and it makes its way into Oz. The idea of that the power of the past exerts upon the present. Right? That's the great theme. It resonates most particularly in Oz's second novel, Michael Shali, My Michael, which very explicitly is modeled in homage to, it's not kindness. You understand the difference between plagiarism and homage, right? Homage is if you're doing it with love. Plagiarism is if you're doing it because you're lazy. It's an homage to B'dmiya Meha. And as it's his second, you understand that an author's second novel is much more important than his first novel. It's easy to be a one-hit wonder. But the second novel, if you can be consistent, if you can keep putting out works of great significance, that's the test of a great artist. So in '68 he publishes Michael Shali. It has a female narrator, Chana Gonen, who's telling this story through a journal. In other words, reading the novel is we are purportedly reading what she's communicating to us, reading what she's writing to us. Following a story of romantic failure and family frustrations. The novel begins, Michael Shali, I am writing this because people I have loved have died. I am writing this because when I was young, I was full of the power of loving. And now that power of loving is dying. I do not want to die. It's written in the shadows of Tirza Mintz's. Tirza Mintz's story ends at the end of In the Prime of Her Life. So ends the Chronicles of Tirza. In my room, now she's married, she's expecting a child. In my room at night as my husband bent over his work and I was afraid of disturbing him, I sat alone and wrote down all I had treasured up in my memory. Sometimes I would ask myself, why have I set my memories down? What new things have I seen and what do I wish to leave behind? Then I would say it is to find solace in writing, and so I wrote all that is written in this book. And if you have the opportunity to read In the Prime of Her Life, and then to read or reread Michael Shali, you'll be more sensitive to these resonances. Oz goes on to say in in the prime of her life, reflecting on it's on the second page here. After he quotes the opening, in the prime of her life, my mother died. The words are almost the same as those Agnon wrote to me about my own mother. She stood upon the doorstep and her words were few. As for me, when many years later I wrote an essay about this story, the essay that I've just summarized for you, about the opening of Agnon's in the prime of her life, I dwelled on the apparent tautological sentence, all the days she sat at home and she never went out of the house. The years of her life, Yemei Shnei Chayeho, sometimes I hear in these words the duality of my mother's life and that of Leah, the mother of Tirza, and that of Tirza Mazal, as if they too cast more than one shadow on the wall. At the end of that chapter, in Sipur Alava V'Choshech, where did it go? Someone give me their copy. I seem to have lost mine. No. Yes. At the end of the chapter, Agnon says, despite all my efforts to free myself from the influence of Agnon, well, he says, for several years I endeavored to free, this is the end, the last paragraph and a half. For several years I endeavored to free myself from Agnon's shadow. I struggled to distance myself from his influence, his dense, ornamented, sometimes Philistine language, his measured rhythms, a certain midrashic self-satisfaction, a beat of Yiddish tunes, juicy ripples of Hasidic tales. I had to liberate myself from the influence of his sarcasm and wit, his Baroque symbolism, his enigmatic labyrinthine games, his double meanings, his complicated erudite literary games. Despite all my efforts to free myself from him, what I have learned from Agnon no doubt still resonates in my writing. What is it, in fact, that I have learned from him? Perhaps this: to cast more than one shadow, to rein in and polish pain. And one other thing that my grandmother used to say in a sharper way than I have found expressed by Agnon, but nevertheless I learned from Agnon: if you have no more tears left to weep, then don't weep, laugh. So that's the way in which one great artist casts multiple shadows into his work and into the next generation of writers. And you know that Agnon is certainly worthy of our attention. But so is Oz, and so are the other great writers. And so are the younger writers that are putting things out today. In each generation there are authors that are worthy of our attention. And if we take the entirety of what I'll call Jewish literature, which includes, of course, things written a century and a half ago in Yiddish, and then in Hebrew, and even some very fine writing that's taking place in our own day in English. If you take authors that are concerned with the situation of Jewish life, so you'll see different ways in which they cast shadows one upon the next. And that's part of what makes our lives as readers and our lives as thinking people so engaged and so animated by what we encounter on the page. And thankfully there are still many amongst us who are engaged with what's written on the page. So thank you all for coming. If you're interested...